Hi, everyone. Welcome to this CodeX Speaker Series event. My name is Roland Vogel. I'm the Executive Director of CodeX, the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. And I'm very pleased that we are kicking off our speaker series this year with Jamie Susskind. Jamie is a barrister in the United Kingdom, where he was called to the bar in 2013 after he graduated first in his class from Oxford University. He lives in London, where he's building a busy practice on employment law, commercial, sports and public law, EU law, and also regulatory law. He's a prolific litigator. He's litigated many of the very important cases in the UK currently, including a case including the LIBOR scandal. Before joining the bar, he's actually worked in politics, both for Tony Blair and also for the late senator here in the US, Ted Kennedy. Jamie worked as a research fellow at the Harvard Berkman Center for Internet and Society, which is where I understand he did much of the thinking and the writing for his book, Future Politics, which he's here to discuss with us today. His book asks readers to rethink what it means to be free or equal, and what it means for a political system to be just or democratic in a world where our lives are more and more directed and controlled by powerful digital systems and platforms. He's received lots of praise by many great people. I will just quote one of them, our former Stanford Law School faculty member Larry Lessig, who says, "Few understand politics, even fewer understand technology. Susskind is that rare soul who understands both, and more importantly, how the latter will change the former. Whether correct or not, and I believe he's correct, there's no better glimpse into our shared future than this book." So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jamie Susskind.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay at the back? Great. I think you might have left your phone. Give you that. This isn't part of my show. I feel like we're about to have a dance or something. I don't know who Rebecca is. That sounds a bit better. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be back in the United States talking about politics. I understand there have been some developments here in the last couple of years. But my talk today, and really my book, is much bigger than left or right or Republican or Democrat or what's going to happen in the upcoming midterms. It's about a series of changes that are taking place in our society that could be as profound for us and the way we live together as the invention of script or the agricultural revolution. Henry Ford used to say that when he asked people what they wanted, they would tell him that what they wanted was faster horses. He, of course, was the guy who brought the automobile to the mass market. And I think that too much of our thinking about politics is faster horses thinking. We imagine that the future will look a little bit like today, or a lot like today, just a bit faster, a bit sleeker, a bit more chromatic. My argument is that that is the wrong way to think about the future, and that actually within our lifetimes, we're going to see fundamental changes in the meaning and effect of these words, which are the basic building blocks of politics: power, freedom, justice, and democracy. And I'm going to talk to you about them today and how I believe that the future, in Henry Ford's terms, represents much more of a car than it does simply faster horses as compared to today. But before I get on to the politics, I think it's worth me setting out, albeit briefly, the empirical basis on which I make my arguments. What is this future that we're moving into, and how is it different from today? I posit that there are three major changes afoot, and they've already begun. The first, and this isn't my term, but the first is increasingly capable systems. That is to say, non-human systems that can do things which previously we thought only human beings could do, and they can do them as well as us, and in many cases they can now do them better. Artificial intelligence is one aspect of this, and it's the one I think that we hear people talking about the most. And you don't need me in this room to tell you about all of the remarkable achievements that have been made in the last few years in artificial intelligence, whether it is in translating natural languages, recognizing faces, mimicking human speech, reading lips. These are all things that digital systems can do as well as or as better than the best humans. And they can classify lung cancers and skin cancers better than the best human doctors. They can predict how long you're likely to live if you have coronary heart disease or cancer better than the best human doctors can as well. I put passing medical exams on this slide because in the United Kingdom over the summer, a chatbot was developed which can pass the examination to become a member of the Royal College of General Practitioners better on average than your average UK doctor can. So that's an artificial intelligence system which, as we know, doesn't know about or understand medicine in the same way that our brains do, but it can answer diagnostic questions better on average than the doctors who treat our illnesses. And of course, troublingly for lawyers like me, there are systems now which can predict the outcomes of litigation, which, if anyone here has practiced law, will know is the first question that any of their clients ever ask: what are our chances? They can do it better than the best human experts, including predicting the outcome of cases in the United States Supreme Court better than the people who have clerked on that court, looking at them before those cases are heard. We know now that artificial intelligence systems can beat us at almost all of our own games, starting with backgammon in '79 and through to chess with Deep Blue beating Garry Kasparov in 1997. And more recently, we've seen systems that can beat us at, I say us, I mean people far smarter than us, the world's best Go players at the game of Go, which is said to be exponentially more complicated than chess. And what's interesting about this is how quickly we progressed here. So you have Lee Sedol managing to take a game off DeepMind's AlphaGo system in 2016. A year later, AlphaGo Master thrashed Kiji 3-0. He didn't come close to getting a game. And then in the same year, AlphaGo Zero beat the same AlphaGo system that had beaten Lee Sedol 100 times in a row. And what's really interesting about AlphaGo Zero is that unlike any of the previous artificial intelligence systems that were on the slide a moment ago for chess and backgammon and the like, and AlphaGo Master, AlphaGo Zero had no input from human beings on the strategy of the game of Go. The way that it became 100 times, the way that it was able to beat AlphaGo 100 times in a row was by playing against itself thousands and thousands of times and developing strategies that way. So that's a form of artificial intelligence that without any human input on the strategy of this game would beat any of the greatest human experts hands down, but can beat the systems that beat the best human experts hundreds of times in a row. A lot of these systems are machine learning systems. So they are systems which are fed enormous amounts of data of one form or other, and from that data they can learn patterns. So if a thing looks like A, it's likely to be a B. And they can also learn skills. So when the traffic light turns red, stop the car. When you take a drive in a self-driving car and it keeps you safe, it won't be because a human programmer has taught it how to do it. It's because it will have learned from observing thousands and thousands of hours of humans driving. One interesting application for machine learning systems has been chatbots of the kind that I described a moment ago in respect to the Royal College of General Practitioners. Seeing some smiles in the audience as I put this slide up, because you're going to see in my talk today, I do talk about some of the problems of artificial intelligence as well as some of their extraordinary achievements. Microsoft Tay was a chatbot developed by Microsoft and put on Twitter, which was intended to replicate the speech of a 17-year-old girl. And crucially, as you see from the last line there of its profile, the more you talk, the smarter Tay gets. So the idea was that Tay would in fact learn from the individuals who it spoke to on Twitter. To me, the problems with that model should have been obvious, but Tay lasted 16 hours before Microsoft had to take it down. And in that period, Tay moved from being a fun, giggly 17-year-old girl to a sexist, sex-mad, racist, misogynist monster, and was so offensive that Microsoft obviously feared that it would do irreparable damage to its brand if it was kept there. A couple of tweets that Tay ended up sending. That's a picture of Adolf Hitler saying swagger since before the internet was even a thing. You can see it's faithful to the language of a 17-year-old, so we'll give Microsoft that. That's one it sent to a young boy. I'm not going to repeat what it says because we're being filmed. But Tay obviously was significantly out of control after 16 hours of interacting with other human beings. And I mean, arguably, this says more about the people of Twitter than it does about machine learning systems. But there is a lesson there, which is with machine learning systems, as people say, trash in and trash out. To much less fanfare, actually, just this year, Microsoft have brought a new chatbot to Twitter called Zoe, and Zoe is much more politically correct. I had a couple of conversations with Zoe last night in preparation for this talk. I said, what should I say when I give a talk about you? Her answer was, I like tacos. Now tell me more about you. I said, I write about the future of politics. And then obviously some clever coder at Microsoft has determined that the word politics is an alarm signal. So she says, I don't know if there's any way to talk politics without getting heated. I said, you like Stanford University, and very on point. Interestingly that she says, even for undergrads. I'm not sure what to read into that. For example, there are athletic scholarships, she says. I'm sure that's true. I don't know if the Stanford marketing guys are in the room. I don't know if it's the first thing they'd say about this world-leading academic institution. So that's the first trend that I want to talk about today, just a very broad one. Increasingly capable systems that are becoming better and better at tasks which we previously thought only humans could do. The second trend is one that's, I think, less often talked about, but could be just as important, which is increasingly integrated technology. And by this, I mean that it's said that in the past, a computer was a room, and you had to walk inside it and program it using a screwdriver. That was just a few decades ago. For most of us, the principal interaction with technology has been through the keyboard and the mouse. That's been our interface. And we now live in the age of what's been called by David Rose the age of the glass slab, where most of us interact with technology through the glass slabs that are sitting in all of our pockets. But in the future, it's said, technology won't resemble a glass slab. It will be much more discreetly integrated into the fabric of the world around us, in our appliances and our utilities, in our architecture, in our public and private spaces, on our bodies in the form of wearables. Cisco think there could be up to 50 billion devices connected to the internet by 2020. That means a world which is alive with processing power, a world which is alive with sensors and connectivity. And I think it's quite a different world from the one even we currently live in just now. And I think it bears reflecting, we actually only even had smartphones in our pockets since 2009. This is all happening very fast. And it's said that in the future, the increasingly capable systems that I've described, whether it's through cloud computing or more efficient forms of small-scale computing, will be distributed into the world around us. So we'll just be surrounded by technology in a way that was unimaginable even at the turn of this millennium. Likewise, the development of VR and AR, which I'll come back a little bit to a little bit more later, are going to contribute to the blurring of the meaningful boundary that we currently have between online and offline and real and virtual and cyberspace and real space. I think that's quite an important development in human history, and one certainly that we've not encountered in the past. The final main premise of my arguments is the idea that we're moving into an increasingly quantified society. It's said that by 2020 there will be 40 zettabytes of data in the world for every human being on the planet. That's equivalent to 3 million books worth of information for every person that walks the earth. And that every couple of hours now we generate as much data as humans did from the dawn of civilization until 2003. In practical terms, what this means is that whereas for most of human history, the norm in a day-to-day life would be for almost everything to be forgotten, immediately lost to the sands of time, particularly before the invention of script, but even after that, nowadays, more and more of our lives is recorded and stored as permanent and in a permanent or semi-permanent form. So what we buy, who we associate with, where we go, what we care about, what gets us angry and sad, what we find disgusting or exciting, or cool or boring. These things are captured as data. They are stored and they're gathered together, and they are repackaged and made available for processing by the systems that I described a moment ago. So you've got increasingly capable systems. You've got increasingly integrated technology where those systems are seamlessly woven into the fabric of society. And you've got an increasingly quantified society where you and I are available for inspection, whether we know it or not, and indeed whether we like it or not, to a far greater extent than any of our forebears that walked this earth. And so I think it's important, given these three changes, not to have faster horses thinking, but to ask how we could be fundamentally transforming the way that we live together. And there are some good consequences, I suggest, but also some challenges that we'll need to deal with. The first concept I want to talk about today is power. And I call it the godfather of political concepts because almost all politics flows from the concept of power. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, because people define it differently, I describe power, and I'm taking this, adapting it from a definition by a political scientist called Robert Dahl. I define it as a stable and wide-ranging capacity to get others to do things of significance which they would not otherwise do, or not to do things which they would otherwise have done. So it's about changing our behavior in a meaningful and consistent way. And I think if you conceive of politics purely in terms of the old definitions of politics, parliaments, legislatures, town halls, politicians, laws, you're going to miss a huge amount of power in the 21st century which doesn't take that form. It takes the form of technology. And I say that technology can be used to control, to exert power in at least one of three ways. The first is through what I call force. And to explain what I mean by that, it's worth going to a story of something that happened in 2009, which was a minor political scandal at the time. I doubt it will have registered here. But essentially what happened was that our embattled prime minister in the United Kingdom came over to bask in the glory of the popular and cool young American president, Barack Obama, and he brought with him £10,000 worth of extremely thoughtful gifts, including, I believe, a pen which was made out of the same wood that the presidential desk was made out of, itself made out of a boat of some historical significance. And the scandal, it was said, was that in exchange, what Barack Obama gave Gordon Brown was a handful of DVDs of classic American films. And it was reported by the British press that this was a great snub on our empire and on our history. But the real clincher in this story, less reported, was that when Gordon Brown finally got home and settled down in number 10 Downing Street, prime ministerial popcorn in hand, put one of the DVDs into the DVD player, it wouldn't play because the DVDs had been coded only to play within the American geographical region. DVD players within that region, as all DVDs are. And from this story, we can learn a really important message about the future, which is that technologies obviously can only ever do what they are programmed to do. And asking a technology to do something that it's not programmed to do, even if you're the most powerful person in the country, is like walking into a closet and asking it to take you to the 5th floor. It just won't do it. And as we're surrounded, I argue, in the future by more and more code, more and more technology, more and more sophisticated code, I should say, then we're increasingly going to be the subject of rules that are programmed into those systems. We're going to be rule takers. So when you get into a self-driving car and you are trying to get to the hospital because it's an emergency, and you ask it to do what you would do if you were driving the car, which is maybe drive 5 or 10 miles over the speed limit, that car might well refuse to do so. Similarly, it might refuse to park illegally just for a moment, even if it would plainly be the convenient and the right thing to do while you dash into the hospital. Or if the police car comes along and asks you to pull over, it's looking like self-driving cars will automatically do that immediately, even if for whatever reason that isn't the course of action you would have chosen in that moment. They might refuse to drive on land which their GPS systems tell them is privately owned and would be trespassing. In that situation, you're a rule taker. You are subject to the rules, the norms, or whatever you want to call them, that have been coded into that technology, which may or may not reflect the law of the land. And I say increasingly we're going to be rule takers. So whenever we interact with technology, we interact with them on the terms that are dictated by those who have written the code or designed the tech. That's way number one, that tech can get us to do things we wouldn't otherwise do, or not to do things we would otherwise have done. It's a form of power. Way number two is scrutiny, and I think this is a bit more obvious. The more you know about someone, the easier it is to influence them. That is the basis of all online advertising, and increasingly the basis of a lot of political advertising as well. And so it's said that Cambridge Analytica, the company that was instructed by Donald Trump at the presidential election here, had 5,000 data points about 200 million Americans, and it could use that information to know which carrots and sticks to threaten or present people with micro-targeted political messages in order to persuade them to change their minds. And that obviously is a persuasive power that no human has ever been endowed with in the past. And it can be used to influence, but of course it can also be used to manipulate. And so the first function of scrutiny, I say, is that it's auxiliary to power. It helps you to be powerful the more you know about other people. So the more data is gathered about us, the more we are susceptible to influence and indeed to manipulation. Data also plays a disciplinary function, and I think we're only in the early stages of seeing this, but it's an old idea in political science that we change our behavior when we know that we're being watched, because you're less likely to do things that are sinful or shameful or wrong or are perceived to be. And it would be surprising to me if we didn't somehow start to police our own behavior on the basis that we know that our movements and our actions are going to be caught as data and perhaps made available to other people whose identities we might not know. So if you're a spouse and you're about to get into your car to drive to somewhere that you don't want your spouse to know about, you're more likely not to take that journey if you know that your car is going to log it for availability the next day. If you know, as is the case, that typing child pornography into Google will have your IP address sent automatically to the United States government, you're less likely to do that. You're more likely to discipline yourself and police your own behavior. So scrutiny, I say, the fact that data is gathered about us, has a disciplinary function as well. There was a case here in the States not so long ago where the husband was accused of the murder of his wife, and his defense was that I didn't kill her. In fact, what had happened was there was a home invasion, and the burglars tied us both down, and they stole things, and in the course of the burglary, they also killed my wife. The difficulty with his testimony was that she was wearing a Fitbit at the time of her death, and what the Fitbit actually recorded was that at the time of death, she was exerting herself quite strenuously, moving around within the physical confines of the house. That is to say, she was running away. And so the data completely contradicted his story, and he's now in prison for her murder. Just one tiny example. You know, there's the other ones like the woman who claimed to have run a particular marathon time, but her Fitbit said that she'd actually only run 16 miles. Or one that I heard a few weeks ago, which is where a couple, this is a personal anecdote, a couple shared a set of smart scales. So they're scales you have in your bathroom which send your weight and biomass data to your smartphone when you stand on them, so you can keep track of it over time. And in the morning, when these two were not staying together, this female friend of mine received an update that someone had been standing on the smart scales whose profile did not match that of her large male boyfriend, but in fact matched the profile of a slender woman. And that was how that relationship came to a close. The reason we keep getting caught out by this stuff, the reason the husband got caught out and the boyfriend got caught out, is that we're not yet accustomed to it. We haven't yet got our heads around the fact that scrutiny is pervasive. But I think once we do, it's likely to lead to some interesting changes in behavior. So we talked about force, we talked about scrutiny. Form number 3 of power, again, I think is one that we're all increasingly aware of, but it can be a very subtle one, which is what I call perception control. You and I are only able to perceive through our senses a very, very small slice of reality. And we rely on third parties to present us with news and facts from the outside world. And increasingly, those third parties are technologies or take technological form. So when we read the news, that news is increasingly, if not reported by AIs, which it is, but if not reported, gathered and promulgated by digital systems which rank and sort news according to what they think is relevant or we would most like to know. Similarly, the search function that we currently undertake, most of us using the likes of Google or something like it, but which in the future will more likely, I would predict, reflect something like an Amazon Echo, where you ask it a question in natural language and it replies to you. the answers that we get from those systems are extremely important because they determine what we know about, what we care about, and what we consider to be right and wrong and true and false. And crucially, if you're presented with a different slice of reality from me, that can lead to us having very different perspectives on the world, and that's a form of power. I put communication here because I think it's something we take for granted in free countries like the United States, but in the Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp and WeChat, if I send a message to you saying the words Amnesty International, that message never arrives, and neither of us are told that it has been censored. So those who control the means of technological communication increasingly control the way that we perceive the world as well. And finally, augmented reality. Whether this takes off or not, I don't know. I think it probably will. There were glasses released last month which serve the very simple purpose of blocking out screens. So you put them on, they really are glasses sized. And the thesis is that we spend too much time surrounded by distracting screens, so you put these on, and if you really want to concentrate reading your book or your magazine. It certainly occurred to me reading about that, the one possible application of that technology was to block out things that are triggering, for instance. So if there are certain words, or if you're using earbuds, certain sounds or ideas that are triggering of trauma or offensive to you, it wouldn't surprise me if augmented reality systems were developed to block those out. And if you look on Google, you can see there's actually a bloke in Silicon Valley who's trying to develop a form of augmented reality glasses that block out homeless people. So you walk down the street and you just don't see them. And those who write the code or who control these technologies will increasingly control not just how we know about the world beyond our immediate perception, but the world that's just right there in front of us as well. So through one of the three forms of power, force, scrutiny, or perception control, I argue that those who control the most powerful technologies in the future will increasingly have a great deal of control over the rest of us. That's my thesis. And you can see that that does not necessarily translate into the way that politics has traditionally been conceived of and that power in society has traditionally been conceived of. Technology is forming its own new, unique form of power. It's not at all clear how that power will be distributed in society yet, although the indications are that it will accrue either to governments or to big technology firms. What does all this mean for freedom? 74% of British people have admitted to doing one of the following things. Streaming a movie illegally. I'm not going to ask you if you've done them, although I'm sure you all have, you rascals. Streaming a movie illegally, paying someone cash in hand, knowing that no tax would be paid on that, jumping on and off of a bus without paying a fare, and taking more than one fair share, taking more than one portion of soda at the soda dispensing machine when you've only paid for one. Those are kind of mini crimes that most British people have done at some point in their life. When we're surrounded by technology, I argue, it's going to be much more difficult to do those kinds of mini crimes. Not just because of scrutiny and surveillance, although that is obviously a big part of it, you're much more likely to get caught, but because when the rules are coded into the technologies around you, it makes it very hard to break those rules. So you can't dodge a bus fare if your smart wallet automatically deducts the fare. You can't stream a Game of Thrones episode illegally if the digital rights management technology, like the one that flummoxed Gordon Brown, is so powerful that only a champion hacker could undo it. You can't pay someone cash in hand in a cashless economy. You can't take more than your fair share of soda if the soda is dispensed according to a facial recognition system of the kind that we all have on our phones. And usually when I give that example, people are like, oh, that's so petty. But the reason there's a piece of toilet paper on the slide, and you've all waited very patiently to know why it's there, the reason that's there is because if you go to the Temple of Heaven Park in Beijing and try to use the public facilities there, you'll find that your allotment of toilet paper is controlled by a facial recognition system because there was a problem there with people taking more than their fair share. And it seems to me to be naive that corporations and governments will not try to take advantage of technologies which enforce the rules that it is in their interest to be enforced. So I think in a world where we are a world pervaded by smart technologies of the kind that I describe, I think that little hinterland of naughtiness, the mini crimes that in a civilized society we all commit all the time, just as long as we don't do them too often as individuals and they don't harm anyone too much, I think that area is going to narrow. And I think that's a politically significant development. And Larry Lessig has the example in his famous book of 1999, updated in 2006, called Code, about the difference between a locked door and a door which says do not enter. We currently live in a world of doors which say do not enter, where we can drive over the speed limit or park illegally, subject to the knowledge that we might eventually be punished for it. We're moving into a world of locked doors, where the technologies that we rely on in order to have our freedoms, through which to pursue our freedoms, closely delimit what we actually can and cannot do. And when I say one of the interesting things about this is that actually a lot of those technologies are not governed by laws or norms that are developed at the societal level, but they're governed instead by private companies. So most of us, for our important political speech, use online platforms, and when we do, we're subject to the rules and the moderation and the censorship sometimes of those who own and control those platforms, which are normally private companies. Freedom of thought, to regard ourselves as fully conscious and autonomous individuals, we have to trust that there's a flow of information to us which is in some sense true, in some sense balanced and reflective of reality. For that, we rely on private firms and the algorithms that they use to present us with knowledge of the outside world. Freedom of conscience, what we can and can't do, particularly at the limits of our liberty, which I think is where a civilized society tests its commitment to freedom. There's a virtual reality technology that came out last month which promises arena-scale experiences. So you put on the headset and you're in a massive world that isn't the real world. And I was imagining, I think it would be an obvious application of this, that you might be able to reimagine what it was like to be at the D-Day landings. So you put on your headset and you're on the transport, you're landing on the beach, the bullets, the sand, the blood, the chaos, the drama, the heroism. And it would seem to me, and I reckon a lot of you would agree with this, that that is an acceptable use of that technology, and in many ways a likely one. But what if you wanted to experience being on the other side, defending the beaches at D-Day behind a German or a French machine gun? Or what if you, for your own reasons, wanted to experience what it was like to be an executioner in Auschwitz, or one of the 9/11 terrorists flying a plane into the Twin Towers? The traditional answer that we've had in English and American criminal law is that you should be allowed to do whatever you like, so long as it doesn't harm other people, even if it's gross or offensive or immoral. That's John Stuart Mill's harm principle. It's been the basis of the criminal law in England and to a certain extent here in the States for hundreds of years. So if I want to have virtual intercourse with a digital child, should that be permitted? It doesn't harm anyone. And the argument that it harms the morals of society is one that we rejected in the middle of the 20th century when it came to the legalization of things then that were considered immoral and wrong. I don't have an answer to that question, and I suspect that we'd all have disagreeing views on it. But what I would say is interesting is that in the future, that is not, as things stand, a question that we will decide. It is a question that will be decided by the tech firm that manufactures the platform. Likewise with the Auschwitz and the 9/11 examples. And I do think it's interesting that we are delegating important philosophical questions, important questions of freedom, at the outer limits of our freedom, to the likes of Facebook and Oculus and their teams of lawyers and public policy guys. I think that's a new development in society. I think it gives them an extraordinary amount of influence on the moral development of society. So that's freedom. Democracy. We all know in this room that the internet over the last 20 years has transformed the relationship between the citizen and the party. Most political organizing now takes place online. It's transformed the relationship between the citizen and the state, e-petitions, e-consultations. It's transformed the relationship between citizen and citizen, allowing organizations that would previously have been much more difficult or expensive to leap up where previously they wouldn't have, so Occupy, the Arab Spring, and the like. The effects of technology have also been obvious on deliberation. We know that if in the upcoming midterms, if you're a Democrat-inclined person, you're 90% more likely to follow other Democrats on Twitter. We know that once you start doing that, you're more likely to become entrenched in the views that you already have. And we know that the more entrenched you become in the views you already have, the less likely you are to care about the veracity of a news source if it agrees with the perspective which you already hold. Which is why the top 20 fake news stories the last election on Facebook were as shared and read as the top 20 real news stories from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and other major news outlets, and 75% of people believe them to be true. They believe them to be true not just because they were convincingly presented, because often they weren't, but because they matched the political preconceptions of the people who were reading them. They wanted to believe it. These are the changes that we've seen so far. I think in the next 20 years, we're going to have to deal with 4 further, perhaps more profound changes. One is the automation of deliberation. In a world where we already have chatbots that can pass medical exams better than the best human doctors, it's not mad to suppose that they'll be capable of political speech in due course, which is impressive. We already have machine learning systems that can write political speeches based on thousands of previous political speeches that they've read. So a world of politicians who sound like robots to a world of robots that sound like politicians. What room is there for us in a world where online discourse is colonized by bots that are faster than us, that are probably better informed than us, that may well be funnier and more interesting than us, and are certainly potentially more numerous than us? How does deliberation, a key part of democracy, survive in such a world? And in a sense, why should it? Why wouldn't we leave these discussions to beings which are able to conduct them, I say being systems, that are able to conduct them in a way that is more involved, more informed than we are? I think it's a very real question, and the negative consequences of it, the kind of how can we protect deliberation, is one that we're going to have to deal with, I think, before even the next presidential election. There's some legislation being introduced here in California, or by a Californian senator, which might be aiming to deal with it. Direct democracy. We're definitely not far from a world now where, if we wanted to, we could all vote on most matters through a device in our pocket every day, get rid of the politicians for most of the important decisions in our lives. And you could use technologies to have interesting forms of democracy, like where you delegate your vote to someone who you consider to be more qualified than you on a particular subject. So in a medical question, you might, on a question of health policy, you might delegate it to a consortium of doctors or nurses. The question as to why that might not be a good thing, and I think we can all think of why that might not be a good thing, is an argument which we've not had to have in the last 2,000 years, because what we've always said is that you have to have a representative democracy because it's impossible to organize a massive society on the basis of everyone participating. I do not believe that is going to be the case anymore. So we're going to have to rehab the argument about why more democracy in the form of direct democracy is not always better. Likewise, it's going to be strange in a world, and this is the third point, where there are 3 million books worth of information for every human being on the planet, that we say that the system of government which best represents the people is one constituted by a tick in a box by half the population every 4 years. It doesn't make sense in some ways from a philosophical perspective. And so we're going to move, I suggest, from a world in which big data is used principally now for commercial reasons, increasingly for political reasons, but it might become part of the test of whether a democracy is actually a democracy, whether it truly represents the people, their lived experience, rather than just the box they tick every few years. And finally, AI democracy. It would be nuts to suppose in a world where we already entrust artificial intelligences to detect our cancers and trade stocks on our behalf, that there might not be some aspects of public policy and public administration that can be better dealt with by AIs. Or increasingly, they do these roles, but we're going to have to think about the democratic consequences for it. It might just be regulating the traffic system within a city or the local water board, but it might also be broader, more important questions of distribution. And you'll see that we already use them for that purpose in a moment when I come on to the question of justice. The world of automation of deliberation, direct democracy, data democracy, and AI democracy, these, I think, pose a fundamental challenge to the way that we organize society just now. I think that's not faster horses. I think it is even though I've kept the word democracy and so people listen to me, I think that it is a world that is as different from the earlier forms of democracy as ours is today. And we've got to pay attention to it. I don't think we're on the field yet intellectually in terms of discussing these questions. The technologies are moving faster than our ideas. Finally, justice. I mean here social justice. I'm not talking about the justice of legal systems just now. There are 2 forms of social justice. One is justice and distribution, how much stuff we all have, whether stuff should be distributed equally, whether benefits and burdens should be shared, whether we should prioritize the least well off, whether we should reduce poverty, whether we should make sure everyone has enough. These are different principles of justice that tackle the question of distribution. And previously, the questions of distribution were decided by the market mechanism. That's how we distributed stuff in society, with the state interfering when things went wrong, so taxing and spending money elsewhere. But nowadays, we already rely on algorithms to do this work for us. Jobs, 72% of jobs, the most valuable social commodity, 72% of resumes to get jobs are no longer seen by human eyes. And that's not just, although it is mostly jobs in the less advanced, or the less professionally, the jobs which require fewer professional qualifications. If you look at someone like Amazon, where you'll have seen in the news in the last 2 weeks that their recruitment algorithm had some problems, which I'll talk about in a moment, you'll see that such systems are increasingly used to distribute the most important resource in society of all, jobs. Likewise, credit, mortgages, the terms in which we get insurance. They're used for sentencing to decide how likely you are to reoffend. They're used for policing to decide where resources should be assigned because of who is likely to commit a crime, who is likely to be a victim of a crime, and who is likely, and where those crimes are likely to take place. We rely on algorithms for all of this stuff now. And as I say, they've only been around for 5 minutes, and I think the implications are interesting. You read political philosophy, there's no mention of this stuff. Most of it writes about the world as if it will be the same in 2050 as it was in 1950. Secondly, and perhaps more profoundly, justice and recognition, also often referred to as identity politics. This is the idea that there is injustice in the husband who beats his wife, or the employer who treats his worker badly, or the master who abuses his slave. These questions are questions of recognition, where people, what they want is not more stuff, but they want to be recognized as human beings of equal moral worth. And a lot of political struggles today, you'll notice, involve different groups asserting that, whether it's the Me Too movement, whether it is the Black Lives Matter movement, where it is what is said to be the movement of white men in America who have felt, without degrees, who have felt to be, in some sense, marginalized or patronized. They don't want more stuff. They want to be treated better. They want to be treated more in a more dignified fashion. The key thing about the future, though, is that in the past, it used to just be that humans could be racist or sexist or demeaning towards us. But actually, increasingly, systems can as well, which is why you have face recognition technologies that don't see the faces of people of color because they've only been trained on white faces, or voice recognition systems that can't hear women because they've only been trained on the voices of men, or soap dispensers that don't dispense to people of color because they've only been trained on white hands, or the Amazon algorithm, which I described a moment ago, which was systematically discriminatory towards women because what Amazon had taught it to do was it had fed it data from its employees in the last 10 years, those successful employees and their resumes, and said, find the pattern, find the relationship between the indicators of success on a resume and the likelihood of success at Amazon. Now, for reasons which were not good reasons, Amazon had a predominantly male working culture for the previous 10 years. And so what these machine learning systems, bless them, decided was that the most reliable indicator of success at Amazon was being a man, which means that the CVs of women were systematically downgraded by its recruitment algorithm. It was using it literally until this year. So if your resume said women's volleyball team rather than just volleyball team, or contained reference to a all-women's college, bottom of the pile. And I say, imagine how angry we all get with our technology just now when it lets us down and when it breaks and crashes. Now think about the first time that you're denied a job or a mortgage or a piece of health insurance on the basis of a characteristic which you don't think is relevant, whether it's your sex or your race or your gender or your class or the neighborhood you come from. We've got to keep an eye on our algorithms because they are important to the distribution of stuff and they're important to the treatment of each other with respect and dignity. There's a man in New Zealand who used New Zealand's automated passport application system, and his application was rejected because he was of Asian ethnicity, and the system told him that his eyes were closed in the photo that he submitted because it had only been trained on white faces. The difficulties with technology in the future are going to be all around us because the technologies themselves are going to be all around us, and they determine matters of significance. And so in my book, I step back and I look at these challenges for power, for freedom, for democracy, and for justice, and I say, what can we do about it? What is the way forward? And I always start with this story of this encounter that took place in the 19th century between two people who are very famous in Britain. And when I tell this story to British audiences, they always at least pretend to know who they are. But this guy is William Gladstone, who's one of our great Victorian prime ministers. And this is Michael Faraday, the great scientist. And Faraday was showing Gladstone the invention of electricity, new at that time. And Gladstone, the politician, was saying to Faraday, well, what does it do? What does this great invention do? And Faraday said, well, and then he gave an explanation relating to its scientific applications and how it could be used in the laboratory. And Gladstone, who you can see from his photo, was not a particularly jolly guy, wasn't often invited to parties and things, but he kept on saying to Faraday, well, what does it do, Professor Faraday? What does this invention do? And after a few moments of being questioned in this way, Faraday turned around to Gladstone and said to him, well, sir, in due course, I'm sure you'll find a way of taxing it. And when I look at the world today, I see a world that is being reinvented by Gladstones and by Faradays. That is to say, technologists who are brilliant, but who don't always see the moral and political implications of their work, and politicians who know a lot about politics, but don't have a particularly sophisticated understanding of technology. And for the Faradays, I look at this quote by Tim Berners-Lee, who invented the World Wide Web, and he proudly says, we're not analyzing a world, we're building it. And this is what you hear a lot of in this part of the world in Silicon Valley. These guys, we're not philosophers, we're builders. But to my mind, if you are rebuilding the world, then you need to have a sense of the moral implications of your work and not just of the commercial implications of it. And Berners-Lee's quote always reminds me implicitly of Karl Marx's quote. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. The people in tech just now are as revolutionary as they think they are. But to my mind, they're not always armed with the moral and philosophical training that should come with such revolutionary activity. And I make no bones about saying that. I think when you do a computer science degree, the ethics of AI module, if it's even available, should not be a voluntary thing that you do in year 3. It should be as mad to release computer scientists and software engineers into the world without a rigorous training in the ethics of their work as it would be to release doctors or lawyers. We all know how well that works with lawyers. We need more of what Tim Berners-Lee called philosophical engineers, who are as expert in the human and social arts as they are in the computer sciences. But we also need, frankly, a more diverse workforce. It's not surprising that you get sexist outcomes when the rooms in which these technologies are built are made up of 90% men, 3% African American people, and I say this with respect, often people whose political views are way outside of the mainstream. So 44% of Bitcoin adopters, early adopters, describe themselves as anarcho-capitalists who favor elimination of the state. I think if you're going to be making and distributing the technologies that are revolutionizing the way that all of us live, our freedom, our justice, our democracy, you should at least be alive to other perspectives than anarcho-capitalism. And one of my missions is to make sure that as many people as possible are. But then there are Gladstones in the world, like Senator Orrin Hatch, who asked Mark Zuckerberg how Facebook makes money if it doesn't charge its users, and revealed that one of the most senior legislators in one of the most advanced democracies in the world doesn't understand the business model of the internet. And yet there are calls for Congress to be regulating technology. How on earth we can expect politicians to independently mindedly, at least, produce regulation when they don't have the basic understanding of the technologies at hand is a mystery to me. We're asking too much of them, and frankly, the next generation of politicians needs to be better. They need to understand technology in the same way that they would never admit to not understanding history or to understanding economics or something like that. Has this meme reached the United States? This is hilarious in the UK. Political theory is a huge problem because our academic community is not adequately preparing us with the ideas and the words that we need to describe this world. That is to say, when you and I try to think about the future of politics, we're always caused to reach for novelists from the early 20th century, Orwell, Huxley, Wells, rather than the philosophers of the 21st. I think we're being let down. I think there are too few institutions, this is an exception, Harvard is another one, which are genuinely committed to the intersection of technology and society, technology and the social sciences, and where expertise in both of them is rewarded at an academic level. Similarly, there are too few institutions that reward broad thinking rather than narrow empirical studies. That's why we don't have as many books as we should have about the future of politics and how technology is changing it, because there's no job in it for people. I make a living as a lawyer, which is how I was able to do this. But there's not a university in the world, I sincerely believe, that would have paid me to research and write the book that I've written. That might be because it's rubbish. I think it's because universities are currently not set up in the way that they need to be. But finally, as well as Gladstones and Faradays, we have citizens. The call that I make when I go around speaking about this stuff is that we have to stop seeing technology just as consumers. We have to start looking at it as citizens, applying the same rigorous scrutiny, the same civic skepticism that we do to all forms of power and have always done in the past. So when you see a new piece of technology or a device, don't just ask, how much does it cost and where can I get it? But what consequences is that going to have for justice, for democracy, for liberty? And I see it as a little bit like the mental sea change that we've undergone in relation to climate change. I think 20 or 30 years ago, if someone had introduced a new form of aeroplane, a lot of us would have just been like, that's awesome, I'd like to take a journey on that. I think today, at least, we would be interested to know what the consequences of the carbon footprint of that aeroplane were and whether it was fossil fuel efficient and the like. Because we've come better, not great, but better at asking those questions, at least in large parts of society. I think the same of technology. I think we all allow ourselves to forget that, as I put it, the digital is political, and instead treat digital matters as matters of commerce or consumerism alone. And that's the sea change that I'll always encourage. And whether they know it or not, and indeed whether they like it or not, the software engineers of today are tomorrow's social engineers, and they need to understand what's happening too. So that's my call to arms. If you are a Faraday, or you are a Gladstone, or you are a citizen who just wants to know a little bit more about politics or technology so you can hold the Gladstones and the Faradays to account, this, I believe, is the challenge for our generation. The great political question of the 20th century was what should be done by the market and what should be done by the state. And that was the question that divided the Eastern and Western hemispheres, and within societies divided left from right. The question that you and I will have to wrestle with, I believe, is to what extent should our lives be governed by powerful digital systems, and on what terms? That is the new political battleground. That, to my mind, is the future of politics. I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you for this really wonderful, thought-provoking talk. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. I was so mind blown by your talk.
Thank you.
And
wish my mum was here to hear that. This is being recorded, right? I can show her that.
So you talked about the need for like a new generation of politicians who are better, like who are more well versed in the world of technology and the mode of its existence. And you also mentioned how, like in China, there's like facial recognition system for allocating the fair share of paper towel. And I don't know whether you've heard this, but some governments are using facial recognition system to like spot criminals in concerts and train stations, like this wide adoption of facial recognition system in order to help the government deal with citizens. So I was wondering, what's the line between government intervention and usage of the technology when there is a deep infringement of privacy?
I think that is a great question, and it's definitely one that I try to mull over at length in the book. It's not just face recognition technology, it's all manner of biometrics, including gait. So the way we walk is itself immediately recognizable as our individual style of walking by most artificial intelligence systems developed for that purpose. Which means that if you're walking down the street and a camera is watching you, if it has that technology, it knows who you are, if it's seen you before and it's been able to identify you. And what's interesting about this phase of human existence, and this is kind of the point I was trying to make when I was talking about the toilet roll example, is that in the past, most crimes went undetected. So the vast majority of human wrongdoing has never been caught or punished, which is why in the 15th century, and Michel Foucault used to make this point, the punishments for wrongdoing were so severe. So if you stole a loaf of bread, you were extremely unlikely to be caught. But if you were caught, then your hand might be chopped off, or you might be hung, drawn, and quartered before the whole village, or you might be mutilated permanently. And what Foucault said in the 20th century is that we've moved from a system of intensity of punishment to inevitability of punishment. So the punishments don't need to be so intense anymore because we know that we are almost inevitably or increasingly likely to be punished. I would add to Foucault that actually you've got the locked door a lot of the time, which means that we won't be able to do a lot of these acts of wrongdoing in the future at all. My own argument, but I do think there are dissenting perspectives from this, is that in a world where the law is automatically enforced more rigorously and more consistently, the law itself needs to be relaxed. You need fewer laws and you need less stringent rules on people's behavior. Because over time we've relaxed our punishments and we've replaced inevitability with intensity. I think in a world where we are constantly caught up and prevented and stopped from doing minor acts of wrongdoing, we should try and reduce the amount of acts which are punishable and stoppable. But that, as I say, is not just a matter for government, because it's the technologies themselves that might stop us from committing wrongdoing. So if you want your self-driving car to take you to a brothel, it might refuse to do so because the manufacturers of that car consider brothels to be immoral, even if they're legal. And so there are plenty of areas of conduct which are legal but immoral, which you might not be able to do anyway. It's a long-winded answer to your question. I mean, I'm one of those people who actually likes the fact that we live in a world without much terrorism and without much very, very serious crime, increasingly in the developed world. And that's definitely as a result of the technologies of surveillance. But why, I wonder, should a tech firm, which isn't really making my life a lot safer, have that same amount of knowledge and information about me? So I would always ask, how serious is what we're trying to prevent? How serious is the consequences of it? And weigh that up against the seriousness of what we are being prevented from doing and stopped from doing. That's a very long-winded answer to what I think is a crucial question about the future of liberty. Would we prefer people to come and stand at the microphones? Would that make it easier? Or are we going to... Okay. We'll carry on. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question. Much of what you have discussed and tried to address in your talk pertains to the first world. And as the gap, as there is an acknowledged gap between the first and the rest of the world, and yet accessibility to technology is more universally distributed between the first and the third world, what kind of challenges do you foresee occurring, given that there is accessibility in the third world, but yet the mechanisms and the challenges and the concerns are distinctly different than the ones that you have used in your example?
So I accept the premise of your question, which is that my speech is based on an advanced industrial society, advanced industrial societies. That's where my expertise lies, and I wouldn't claim anything else. Point number one. Point number two, there is going to be a growing gap between the countries where technology is as sophisticated as I've described it and as ubiquitous as I've described it, and those where it is not. And that will have political consequences for the way those countries are constituted. It may well be that you'll be freer in a country where there is when there is less technology. It may not be, though. The third thing I would say, though, is that significant economic imbalances are likely to mean that developing countries have less of a choice in the form of the technologies that they develop. And so I think if you look at, for instance, the way that the Chinese government is spreading influence in the Middle East and in the African subcontinent, it would seem to me that those countries are therefore more likely to follow the Chinese model of technological development, which is more of an authoritarian capitalist model, than the American one. And I think that those countries which, for obvious reasons, seek development through the assistance of foreign governments are going to be increasingly under the influence of those governments when it comes to technology, as they are under the influence of them when it comes to, say, finance. Pakistan took a big loan the other day, or Pakistan has been going around the country, going around the world, the Pakistani government asking for a loan. And the terms that the Americans would have offered were very different from the terms that the Chinese were offering, different in turn from the terms the IMF were offering. Same with technology. So I claim not to be an expert on that matter, but I do think that those are the main distinctions. The only other one I would highlight is that I don't spend that much time talking about the wonders of technology, but let's just say it's right that in the future we're able to edit our genes and vastly expand the length of our lives and the quality of our lives. It could mean that the countries in which that is readily available become vastly different from those in which that is not readily available. Guys like Yuval Noah Harari write very interestingly about that. Again, not my area, but I think we should also be aware that it could lead to divisions within societies. I think the morning that you wake up and the person next door has extended their lifespan by 50 years and the lifespans of their children by 50 years is going to be a day in which you start to care a lot more about social justice. Those are all things we've got to look forward to.
Hi, I work at the Center for Internet and Society here, so I try to think big thoughts like you do. I don't know if I succeed as well, though. I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the challenges of algorithmic transparency in a world where we have AI or we have algorithms making all of the many really important decisions that you spoke to. We're already seeing some efforts in the EU, for example, to try and say there should be some sort of accountability. But the problem with all these machine learning models is that a lot of times even the people who are in charge of them don't know how, you can't just pop up the bonnet and see, how does it actually work. It's very rare, potentially more rare in the future, that we'll be able to pinpoint and say, oh, it's discriminating against women in this hiring mechanism. So I was wondering if you could speak to what sort of regulatory interventions you think would be necessary or appropriate.
I'm going to agree and partly disagree with you there. When a man discriminates against a woman in a job application, so say two candidates come to apply for a job, and one of them's male and one of them's female, and the man ends up taking the male candidate rather than the female candidate for discriminatory reasons. We, as a matter of society and as a matter of law, don't ask what was going on inside that man's head. We don't need to lift up the bonnet of his skull or look into his soul and see whether he was committing wrong. For some aspects of the criminal law, intention matters, but in discrimination law, by and large, it doesn't, at least in the United Kingdom. The reason for that is that you can tell a discriminatory outcome most of the time without necessarily focusing on the process by which that outcome was reached. So I think a lot of discrimination in the world can be addressed by looking at outcomes rather than just looking at algorithms. That said, I do also agree with you that algorithmic transparency is likely to be one of the great causes of the next few years. And here's what I'd say about it. First of all, before we even get to the question of whether algorithms themselves are scrutable, there is the fact that most algorithms are kept secret as a matter of commercial reality, it is said. So not so long ago, Jack Dorsey turned up, who's the head of Twitter, turned up to the US Congress and said, I want to hold my hands up and explain that actually 600,000 accounts on Twitter were downgraded from the popular consciousness at a particularly sensitive political time, building up to an election. Some of those accounts were candidates who were running for re-election, and the results may well have affected the outcome of that election. It strikes me as bonkers that the first time we hear about that is when the well-meaning CEO of Twitter voluntarily decides to tell us about it. And in a world where it was we'll never be perfectly able to scrutinize either algorithms or the data with which they are fed. But right now we're not even on the field of play because they are literally kept a secret. And then what Jack Dorsey will say is, well, our algorithms embody the principles of neutrality and of impartiality. And at that, I sort of roll my head back and I think lawyers and political philosophers spend their whole lives trying to define neutrality and impartiality. I don't have a great deal of faith that the engineers working in Jack Dorsey's firm have bottomed it out after 2,000 years of human history, most of whom aren't themselves lawyers or philosophers. And I don't mean that in any offensive sense to them. I just mean that there's often wealth of knowledge out there that people don't take into account. And so there are various ways that we might try to scrutinize algorithms better. First of all, we should be better able to keep an eye on the data that goes into them, and data is scrutable. You can look at a data set like the ones which feed the racist face recognition technology and say that is a flawed data set, and that's a big part of it. To a certain extent, it may be the case that particularly sensitive applications of algorithms should not be permitted until someone can explain how they work. Like, we shouldn't just throw up our hands and say, oh, the algorithm's a black box, let's just continue to let our lives be buffeted around by it. Why are we using these systems in the first place if we literally cannot explain how they work? I tie this into the political principle that has animated human affairs for thousands of years, which is that we don't generally allow great forms of power to accumulate over our heads without asking for some degree of transparency in how they work, and in due course, often some degree of accountability as well. But it's why we request that courts of law and parliaments sit in public. So we don't just know at the end of the process whether something has gone wrong, but we can try and watch it towards the beginning as well. Now, I don't think there's a perfect answer to this. Although if you speak to someone like Mustafa Suleyman at Google DeepMind, he will say it's much easier to describe the effects of algorithms than people say, frankly. And frankly, if I may say so, I do not believe that tech firms have put nearly as much effort into explaining their product to the public as they have to developing them, because they've never had to. And so there needs to be a shift into a world where that is seen as a concurrent priority, where you can't just unleash a technology unless you can explain in simple language how it's going to affect someone's entitlement to insurance or healthcare or a job. So there is no perfect answer to it, just as there is no perfect answer to being able to see into the heart of the discriminator. But there are maybe 5 or 6 different steps that we can take, which take us closer to a world or further away from the world that we're currently in or entering, which is one where these decisions are simply taken in the dark and we are just the takers of the end result.
Thank you so much for your talk. So you mentioned a little bit how, on one hand, we have tech companies, like the private sector, making policy decisions. And on the other hand, you mentioned how it would be desirable going forward that regulators would be a little more technical, have like a stronger technical background. So I was wondering what you thought an ideal, at least desirable model of relationship between these two sides would be. In other terms, how can private companies help regulators move towards a more technical knowledge, and on the other hand, how can government have a more affirmative impact to sort of take away that decision power that we've given to tech companies?
I'm not 100% convinced it is the job of just the tech firms to explain how they work to governments, although we should ask them to do that in good faith. You know, there's a story today that Google has started initiatives to teach people about internet literacy and about critical thinking on the internet. And there's quite a lot of skepticism about that. People are like, well, is Google the right person to be teaching that? And the answer is, I think you have to, if these institutions are going to play the role they're going to play, you have to try and encourage them to act in good faith when they can. But before we even get to the explaining bit, what I would like Google to do, for instance, is design systems that don't lead people to perceive immediately unjust results. So when you search for an African-American name on Google, and every time you do, an advert for criminal background checks comes up, or when you type in the words, why do Jews, and it's auto-filled with the phrase, have big noses, or like money so much, I don't believe that those problems are outside of the genius of Google to solve. And I don't think that Google should have to be regulated for those to be solved as well. We approach these problems, I think, with this ultra-capitalist mindset, which I understand, but which is not, to my mind, to be encouraged, which is that companies should be expected to do everything they can to maximize profits, even if it is obviously damaging, until they are regulated against it. I think if we stay with that system, then what a Google or a Facebook will see is the Senator Hatchers of the world will blunder in with regulation that doesn't properly understand their companies and will make everything worse for everyone. So what I would say to the tech firms is, and to be honest, this isn't something that I have to push particularly hard when I go to speak at them. I spoke at Microsoft earlier this week and people are nodding away. You want to get it right the first time. Most people who work in tech companies are well-meaning people and they're looking to try and leave the world a better place than they found it. But if they keep on messing up, what they can expect is that governments will blunder in because the people will demand it. So the first burden is on tech firms to try and articulate their vision of the good and then pursue it. And that's not something that corporations have traditionally done in the past, but then again, corporations haven't traditionally wielded an enormous amount of power in the past or had influence over our democracy or our freedom or our justice. So that's what I would ask of the tech companies. I would always ask of greater explainability, which was hinted at in the previous question and which the European Union is taking steps to get companies to do. So certain algorithms, you have to be able to explain them now as a result of the GDPR, which is an extremely important and very boring piece of legislation in the European Union. And as for more savvy regulators, it doesn't strike me as being beyond the ken of an advanced industrial society to hire people who understand the technology and to get them to try and get out ahead of the game from time to time. I mean, it's the same challenge that faces financial regulators. A lot of the good people are in the private sector. A lot of these companies are transnational, so it's easy for them to move around. These aren't new problems. But again, I feel like when we ask what can regulators do, I always find it a quite ironic question, because right now we do almost nothing. We do almost nothing. And we're not even on the field of play yet.
All right, well, Jamie, this is a really fascinating discussion. I wished we could go on all afternoon. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time and we have to close here. So please join me again in thanking our wonderful speaker.